I think there's probably no area of our lives that can be a source of more trial to us than our work lives. It's so central to our daily schedule, but also to our sense of identity as men, maybe too much so. That's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, particularly about when we might be facing change or transition in our work world and how we might come at that. So we have a panel discussion today. I'm looking forward to you hearing from our guests, because they have learned some real life lessons in the trenches of transition themselves. And I think that the things that they have to say today will be a source of hope for you if you're going through or facing or anticipating change in your world. I think it'll be a source of hope. And I think that the practical experiences that they share may become a source of for you in understanding some of the next steps you might take. Our guests today are Mike Gustafson, who is the general manager with Petro Rabigh right now. He'll be with us from Saudi Arabia today. And Andy Hovis, who's vice president with Cross Development, and he'll be coming to us from Katy, Texas today. And then Mark Vise, who's the executive vice president, CFO with Burrow Global, coming to us from Houston today. And each of these men have gone through transitions in their work world and have some things to say to us today. So we'll welcome our panelists to join us now. There we go. Let me just introduce these fellows to you. In the light blue shirt is Andy Hovis, I mentioned, with Cross Development and coming to us from Katy. In the dark colored shirt is Mike Gustafson with Petro Rabigh coming to us from Saudi. And then in the plaid shirt is Mark Vise coming to us right here from Houston. Great to have you guys with us. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to join us. Appreciate it. Before we start, I just want to mention that we're going to have a little Q&A kind of time as we go. I'm just going to be asking these fellows a number of different questions and letting them share their story through that. But if you have questions, on the bottom bar of your Zoom page there, usually, maybe it's on the top, there's a Q&A button. Boy, by all means, type in your questions. And if we can, at the end, we'll get to those and let these guys share a little bit more of their experience in pointed ways that they go to maybe where you're living. So let me just do this. Let me just, Andy, I'll just start with you. I'm going to invite each of the guys just to take a few minutes to just share their transition story with us a little bit to get us set. Andy?
Sure. Well, when I first got out of school, I was fortunate enough to work for what amounted to a franchise startup company. And over about 11 years there, we grew it and had really a lot of fun and a very good time doing it. And after our best year, and my department's best year, and I think the company's at that point too, I was on the phone one afternoon talking to somebody. I don't even recall who. It has fled my mind since. And the CEO of the company stepped in, and at that point I was a direct report to him, and he stepped into my office and put a folder on my desk and walked right back out. And so I finished my conversation and thinking nothing of it. And then I opened the folder at probably 10 minutes later, and found a severance package and a check all inside the folder. So my story is one that's kind of a shock. It was unexpected and also handled very poorly. There hasn't been really a conversation of substance with him since, which is a real shame. I often tell people of the 1,000 relationships there, 999 of them are excellent. But really out of the blue one day, that happened. And it had nothing to do with work. It really had to do with an interpersonal conversation that the two of us had that, unbeknownst to me, had deep impact. And so that's kind of my transition story on the negative side. And then the positive side of it is in relatively short order, found myself in a career that's been more fulfilling. And I would say 5 years later, it's one of the best things that's ever happened to me. Wow. But that's, didn't necessarily feel like that day one.
I am sure not. Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Well, you mentioned shock. Mike, can I turn to you then? Just give us the overview of your story as well.
Yeah. So I'm an oil and gas guy, like probably, a lot of the guys that are on this call from the Houston, Texas. and started my career in the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and we've gone through a lot of different cycles. And then the transition really began for me in 2015. In late 2014, early 2015, price of crude oil was crashing. And I was working at ConocoPhillips as the global vice president of business development, and was letting go of most of my BD guys, most of the business development guys, over the 6 months of 2015. And while I'm doing all of that, I get the phone calls are still coming in from recruiters, and I get a call from Saudi Arabia, and I kind of pushed it off. It really didn't sound that initially that interested to me. So I pushed it off to a guy that actually I just let go a couple of months earlier. And they came back to me right away after talking to him and said, "Hey, we still would like to talk to you." And I go, "Okay, you flew all the way over here. Sure, why not? I'll meet you down at the Hotel Derrick." We had a meeting, and then the meeting went great. I thought it was a meeting. They thought it was an interview. And the next day I get the phone call that said, "Hey, you passed your interview, and we're going to give you your offer sheet." I go, "What does that mean exactly?" Well, I get the offer sheet, and they go, you have until the end of September to decide, 2015. Well, on September 16th, I go into my boss, and I'm reporting to the CFO, and I'm talking about the restructuring, and how we're reorganizing. And he gives me the news that I've been laid off. And I'm like, whoa, you talk about the shock. It was really a total sucker punch. And so, initially I went into, I don't want to say denial mode, but I definitely went into a saving face mode of operation, and rebranded everything as I negotiated this, I negotiated the leave as opposed to being laid off. So I lied to myself. Next I started transitioning after that into starting, got some advice and started transitioning into Gustafson Energy. Because I felt like, going from ConocoPhillips and, where I traveled the world, the next step was to go into start up my own oil and gas company. That seemed to be the flavor of the time, and go raise $500 million and go chase deals. And so I started to do that. In the meantime, I told the Saudis, you know what, by then I felt like the visa process was going to take 6 months, maybe give or take a month. So why not go ahead and just do that in the event while I'm doing the Guidestone deal? Well, that went on, and right in the middle of all of that, my son gets sick, and in February, and deals for Guidestone weren't coming through. I was talking to a lot of people. I was talking to my own circle of trust, my own very close confidants. Maybe some of these guys are on the call today. And so I told the Saudis, I can't go because my son was sick. I mean, he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and they needed me to be there. And so now I no longer had a plan B. I was like full in, man. I'm all in here, even further committed to this deal. And still no traction. We got close, but still no cigar, as they say, right? So we get into Christmas, and the Saudis reach back out. We connect again, and I go, well, I'm gonna need a couple of months to think about this, because we're in the middle of our third transaction at that time. And in February, when that really tanked, I went to the family and I says, hey, I think it's time for me. I think God is really pushing me to Saudi. And so I'll share more about that journey, but that's kind of a high level overview of the really two transitions that took place for me.
Yeah. That's great. Mike, do I remember when you and I talked offline, you were talking about the shock of it, that you said you can remember the exact day, time, suit you were wearing, socks you were wearing?
Hey, September 16th. I know the suit. As a matter of fact, just for tonight, I brought the socks out and I'm wearing them for this call.
Whoa. Gonna repurposing the socks, man.
I am. I love it. So, yeah, and then afterwards, I'm going to probably take him out in the the Red Sea that's out here, and just let him go. Put him in a bottle and send him your way.
I love it. I love it. That's so good. Oh man. Oh, Mark, let's turn to you. How about
All
your
right.
transition story? I know there's a couple chapters to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've got two actually. One by necessity and one by choice. And
Yeah.
early in my career, it was actually my first CFO role. I was with a software company for about 7 years, and the one thing you don't want to have when you have it's a public company, when you have a very low stock price, is a very healthy balance sheet and a lot of cash. And we had a very dynamic CEO who had just been lured back to his former company. So it was the perfect recipe for a hostile takeover. And so we had a group of investors that came in, um, and they sold off the technology, took the company in a totally different direction. What they were really after was the public shell and the cash, and then selling the technology for additional cash. And with that, they put the executive team, me included, into transition. So that was one kind of, with Andy and Mike, a little more of a shock that even though I did see coming, I didn't see coming. It's one of those. And then about 5 years ago, uh, one that was it was a different situation. It was by choice, in that we had the company I was working for, we had a new CEO come on board, and I'd been there about 9+ years and was actually ready to do something else too. And I knew eventually he would be wanting to bring in his own team. Um, so in so that one was more by design. But the one thing that's interesting is whether it's and a lot of people probably can attest to this, but whether it's by necessity or design or choice, you still have to navigate those transition waters, and that's still difficult, whatever the situation is, I think, for us. So that's kind of my story.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate it. Well, I led into this before bringing you guys on by talking about no pain, no gain, and that there are trials that come and challenging times in our life, and oftentimes in the midst of the challenge is the only part that we can clearly see. It's sometimes difficult to anticipate the gain at the end of it. But if you guys don't mind, just kind of letting us peek into your world a little bit, can you tell us some about the fears or the frustrations that you might encounter along the way, or also, I think we all would acknowledge that work is a super important part of our life as men, and sometimes maybe too much so. And how do you handle any condemning thoughts or sense of failures that come in the backside of transition moments and that sort of thing? Kind of wide open there. Fears, frustrations, and condemning thoughts, etc. Buddy?
Well, I think I'll start that. I think you know, I think given with men especially, and is there, when you do go through a transition, there is a certain degree of sense of failure that you have to deal with. And I think it's, the one thing you have to just understand, that it's going to come with some real highs, and it's going to come with some real lows. And the key is not to get too high or too low, and to really keep that as best you can sense of equilibrium. And it's tough for guys, because I think there's a sense of responsibility, there's a sense of pride that comes along with your work life. And one of the things that it taught me that that I've never forgotten, and I have to say, I have to continue to remind myself, and that is, don't let your self-worth get wrapped up in your job. And I think that is so important. And it's something, as men, we have to constantly, I know I do, have to constantly remind myself. So, so that to me is really important.
Yeah. Well, I think you touched on a real live nerve for us there, of not letting our self-worth get wrapped up in our work. That is a key battlefront. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking back, initially you say, what could I have done about it? What could I have done differently? And if those are all, retrospective questions that really will not undo what's already been done. And it's actually burning through. So that was kind of like the initial wave. And then it went into, oh my gosh, what will people think? And it's kind of like, as Mark just said, oh my gosh, I'm such a failure. I've just let these people down. And then you move into the what's next stage. And it seemed like, I ran through all of that in a very short period of time. And at the end of the day, and I as I'm reflecting on this, I just needed to own it. I needed to put the pride out of the way and just own this issue. And I just jumped right into do mode, as opposed to just stop and just reflect and use this time to, take a sabbatical, to think, to pray. I felt like I got to move. We're built to go. And my other job changes in the last 30 years, it was always things were lined up. Well, now the tables had turned, and I felt like I only knew one other thing, and that was I got to get back into instead of just stopping and holding back.
So, Mike, I want to come back to that idea of sabbatical in just a moment, because one of the things you said to me is you wish you'd called a timeout. We'll come back to it in a minute. But let me just kind of press into the idea of owning it for a second. What does that mean in retrospect? If you were in that moment again, you could go back and redo it, and this time you're going to own it. What does that mean you would actually do? I mean, is there something you can flesh out on that?
Well, I felt
Or
like,
not do?
yeah, well, the thing is that, yeah, I mean, part of that was, I was so worried about other people that I really needed to just kind of zero in on my vertical relationship. I was so focused on my horizontal relationships around the people around me, family, my friends, my mentors, about focusing on next. And my relationship with God, which was great, morning quiet times. I should have gone deeper. And that's what I learned through this process. I honestly, I felt like I let other people own, as I was going horizontally, I was letting other people, share their thoughts and share their concerns and giving, I was inundated with so much advice that I was ignoring the greatest advice of all, which is the advice of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so I should just own the whole process, and instead of getting myself surrounded by advisors, I was almost overly communicated by others,
Oh, wow.
which I love their love. I love the love. But it was the balance of the scales were totally tilted away from Christ.
Okay.
And as men, we own that. We need, that's our choice, right? We need to, and that was why I was saying I should have just stopped it and shifted gears here. And I didn't, and it was a runaway train.
Yeah.
And it went on for a year. It cost me a lot of money, and there's a lot of lessons learned that we'll talk about later.
Okay. Thank you. Andy, how about you?
Well, I would say, and I think this is true, it's been true in my faith world, it's been true in the work world, that I think almost every man has anxiety that's about right here. and they're working as hard as they can. And sometimes you're not working as hard as you can. That's a different issue. But sometimes you're working as hard as you can. And as long as you feel you're being successful, you can breathe. So all the responsibilities, whether you list them or not, you feel like they're stacking up, and that's family, that's kids, that's work relationships, whether you're responsible to someone above you or below. And I would think that the biggest thing that from a fear standpoint that comes in transition is all of a sudden, if you feel like anxiety is here and now you lost the thing you do 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, the thing that gets you the most kudos from your peers, and that's gone, all of a sudden you feel like it's here. You're in a situation where you literally feel like you could be drowning. And I would say that the best thing in my transition was I had, much like Mike, I had some wonderful men come alongside that were very helpful. As a side note, and this may be too late, depending on where you're at listening to this conversation, it drove home how important it was all the years that we lived below our means, so that when you're in that moment, you don't have to make an emergency decision. So I'll say the one thing that helped there was I didn't have the financial anxiety that I might have had if I was living paycheck to paycheck, kind of a thing. And I know sometimes that's not an option, but it put me in a position where that anxiety, I really had to seek out an actual method of dealing with what amounts to idolatry. When you put work is that important to where if it changes, you feel like you're drowning, your work is in the totally wrong position. I came home to a wonderful spouse, and I came home to wonderful kids that were very accepting of it. All my friends were very supportive in it. And so, I found myself at night, like I would have like 2 glasses of wine and be like, I think I need a third. and after about 2 weeks, I was like, this is a terrible way of dealing with this. You just realize I'm trying to take care of a circumstance and not take care of the actual issue that I'm having, which the issue isn't my job and it isn't this bottle of wine or whatever it was. It was really that I had bound up inside my heart the fact that if I wasn't doing this well, I wasn't doing anything. And that became very clear. And so what I would say from the fear standpoint, the fear is you'll never feel on top of it again. You'll never feel professionally fulfilled again, is really what kind of comes about. Forgive me there, camera stuttered. And I would say that the best thing that happened to me then is I basically started writing out every night. The Philippians chapter 4 is the best thing in this situation. If you've never read it, read it, pick up a New Testament. But it basically talks about, and I won't quote the whole thing, but it says, let your reasonableness be known to everyone and start begging. It's effectively what the verses say there. And it basically says you need to ask, if you feel like you don't have peace, there's only one place that's coming from, and it won't be a new job. And it won't be a new career. And that, I'll say the lesson that I took away is that, more than anything else, from that shock and those fears of place and purpose and family have really all dissolved. I'll be like Mark and say you have to remind yourself of the truth of this. But on a day-to-day basis now, the best thing that happened out of this transition is work to me is a toil that has to be done, and I enjoy it often, but it's really just work. And everything else in my life is almost more important. And how do you quantify that? And it's very hard. So, and how do you, so I see someone's asking how to keep the anxiety lower than that. Yeah. I mean, that's really the secret. The secret is realizing that you can't do it yourself. If you think you could control all of your environment, that's the major problem. You just can't. It's not within you to control, no matter how well you manage it. And so, and once you realize that, one of the things I tell my friends, I'm sorry if I'm talking too much, Tom, just interrupt me. One of the things I tell my friends all the time who are going through this now is, my dad very graciously, right when this happened, called me and he goes, son, you're a pretty good achiever. I bet you thought this would never happen to you. And he was like, and I was like, yes, that's correct. I did not think this would ever happen to me. Now, since I've transitioned twice and it's been fun, but at that time it wasn't. And the thing that stuck with me was this idea that the anxiety is really not having to do with circumstance. And I need to consistently be going to, I tell Christian men all the time that if you believe in Jesus and you want a relationship with him and your work is your number one priority, God will take it from you because he loves you too much to keep it that way. And so what I found was that God was consistently telling me in my life, every time I would achieve something and think I was special, wham, just take it away. And he didn't do it because he was angry at me. He did it because I was living in full of anxiety, and I had to be trusting in him. So that answers your fear question.
I'm glad you saw that question there. One of our viewers asked, "How do you keep anxiety from the tip of your nose?" And so, just to reiterate, what the passage that Andy mentioned is Philippians 4, which you can look to on your own, but it has a string of things included in there that would probably be helpful. One is basically how to pray for peace in the midst of anxiety in verses 6 and 7. And then it talks about learning contentment, in all things and being able to do all thanks to Christ who gives us strength and so forth. So I'm not sure all exactly the ones that were most poignant to Andy, but I think you'll find in that passage, Philippians 4, some help in that battle.
I think, Tom, some of the, just to reiterate, I think some of it's a cultural thing, I think, in the U.S. I mean, if you look at, you meet someone in Europe and you're more than likely, they're going to ask you, what do you like to do? And you think about when you meet someone new in the U.S., what's the first question they ask you? Who do you work for and what do you do? And for someone in transition, that can be an uncomfortable question.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Because, and I think that cultural thing is sort of helping to establish more and more that sense of identity equals your work. Yeah. Mark, while you're speaking, I'll just turn to you, see if you have another insight on this. One of our viewers has written in to ask, what are some things that you in particular do to help build a sense of self-worth outside of work? In other words, I think we all recognize there's that is a battlefront. Any particular, probably this go to anybody really, any practices or that helps in that battle between work equals worth?
Well, I think it's, it's a struggle that, I think all men, we go through. And I think part of that is developing interest outside of work, and developing and relying on your network of friends, your family, and getting pleasure and fulfillment, I think, as Andy said, outside of just that work environment. And it can be as, I'm a gym rat, so it can be as easy as, working out with a group of guys in a gym, that gives you that feeling of you're doing something positive for yourself.
And that doesn't hurt at all in regard to dissipating the adrenaline that comes with anxiety too. In the midst of it. And sometimes your inclination is not to go and to do like that. So good. So let's talk a little bit about how you guys move forward, or lessons you've learned about moving forward. One question that's come in is, what specific steps would you recommend to a guy who's just taken a body blow, a big bad surprise, and needs to shift or refocus or retool to something, and Mark, one thing you told me offline is you got to have a plan. So, the initial shot's been taken and now you got to do something. Tell us a little bit about that from y'all's world.
I'll just say something and let Andy and Mike jump in, but I think, you're right. I think when you're put in a transition, you do one of two things typically is you either take some time off, and, in some cases you're able to do that because maybe your package gives you that financial freedom that Andy talked about, or you dive right in and start emailing and texting all your network and so forth. And I think the answer lies somewhere in between. I think I've seen some friends and colleagues that waited months to really engage in their search. And during that period of time, unfortunately, I saw them lose a lot of confidence. And then once they re-engaged, there was a real sense of urgency that I have to do something quick, which is not good. But on the other hand, I think you have to have a plan. You have to have a roadmap, because what I've been so pleasantly surprised over my career is people genuinely want to help, but you have to be able to articulate what you're looking for. And I think that's key.
Mm-hmm. Mike, tell us a little bit about more your experience in that.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of go a little bit deeper when I mentioned in the intro, and that is, initially I went out and I hired some advisors. I hired some outside legal counsel. I met with my own, like I mentioned, a circle of trust guys. And, it was always, I was in that very much action-oriented mode. And I thought for sure that was God's will. That was going to be the plan for me. And it wasn't until, the frustration of And that was the strategy and a part of transition one. And then when my son was sick and I literally turned down that job, it dawned on me that I was really the job, changing from ConocoPhillips to being more at home was there. God was placing me there to take care of my family. I mean, that was the purpose. It took me a while to kind of, for that aha moment to take place, because I thought, hey, I was let go so I can go do this. Well, there's other things there that were at play. You know, God's always working behind the scenes here. And he wanted me to be there with my son, not traveling the world, not anywhere else. He wanted me to be right there for him. And then when he graduated in May 2017, 2 days later, I'm on a plane to Saudi Arabia. And now there's a lot of prayer, a lot of prayer that went on during that period of time. But I got some awesome advice. And God spoke through two men that many of you guys probably know, Jeff Von Cannon and Jeff Reeder. And Jeff Reeder said, Mike, you got to know what your non-negotiables are when you're looking out at opportunities. What are your non-negotiables as you head to Saudi Arabia? And then develop your master action plan, develop your MAP, MAP. Because part of the role going into Saudi was I had 90 days where I could leave without any sort of issue. That was part of the contract that I served. So I used that 90 days to really assess and to be in prayer. And you talk about, the question was about, where do you get your worth out? Where do you get your worth outside of work? I felt like I was headed to Saudi. This is like the mission field. Actually, I looked at this whole deal as, you know, God said to Abram in Genesis, right? I felt like, man, he must want me to go do something over there. I don't know what is going to take place, but he wants me to go there. The fact that they came around the second time, the fact that things are going pear-shaped here in Houston, it felt like there was this wave, and my son had graduated and it was off to the University of Arkansas, Pig Suey, right? That was being taken care of. He figured out the new normal. And so it was kind of like my wife and I were now faced as empty nesters. The timing was right. So anyways, so the takeaways here were, you know, as you look at your new opportunities, think about the non-negotiables, things that you are just not going to accept. And for me, that was, can I worship my faith here in Saudi Arabia? And God answered that the first week I was here. I was in a taxi cab. They gave me a card. I work at a plant. I traded my business suit for a PP&E, you know, fire retardant uniform, like a school uniform that you wear every day. And I go to a smelly petrochemical plant. Anyways, so I'm being driven, and I see that it's a Filipino. I go, so are you Muslim? Because you cannot evangelize. You cannot talk about Christianity. So you spin it around. You say, so are you Muslim? And he goes, no, I'm a Christian. I go, wow, that's great. So do you go to church? Is there a church here? You know, like underground? And he says, yeah. So that week he picks me up, and boom, we're off to the races. And it was, and I haven't looked back. And that's where I get my self-worth.
That's awesome. I mean, that's really cool, because you know, I think probably people are real familiar with like the 23rd Psalm, which sort of poetically describes God as a shepherd, but it's a really profound thing, not just a poetic thing, when you begin to experience that in your life, of him guiding you along the way. So that is great, Mike. Andy, let me go up to you, because you kind of came to a fork in the road when you're in this spot where you're going to, like, am I going to go do something dramatically different, or am I just going to look for the same thing? Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm a little bit of an adventurer by nature. And so I got to watch as a kid, and this kind of enters into this. My dad worked for a major, you know, a big firm in the Midwest, and transitioned our whole family to Texas. And then after about 10 years of working far too many hours, said, I'm done. And so when I was in high school, my father basically retired to become a college professor. And so I got to watch somebody take a very different career track. And I thought, when this happened, I've always wanted to teach and things like that. I've served on different school boards and things of that nature. And I thought, maybe this is the time. I really don't value money the way that I think sometimes men do. I don't know what that is, but I thought, oh, I'll take a little less and maybe I'll go be a teacher. That'll be a blast. And I really just started analyzing my options. I looked at teaching. I looked at for furthering my education. I read constantly, so that would be fun for me. And I started looking at all those different options, and it became what you said, MAP, Mike. I hadn't used that particular process before, but what I really did was sit down and go, okay, what are the things that are required of me as husband, father, and son, and I was like, okay, what is required of me? And it became, I started kind of laying out. I was like, you know what? I want my kids to have these kind of options if I can. I'd like my wife to have the ability to do this kind of ministry opportunity if she'd like. I'd like for us to be able to do these types of things in our life that made sense to us. And so when I did that equation, I said, well, you know, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense right now in the middle of my career to go be that particular thing. And so it really, the Lord used some friends, but also just that analysis to help steer me back to, I don't think I've even said it, but effectively I'm a real estate executive. So what I do is develop property. And it became very clear that although I went from a very, not really that secure, obviously, in the long run, but from a very normalized development world where I had one client that I did tons of work for, all of a sudden, I mean, God was very clear where he says, you know, you're going to take some more risk. And I went into the independent development world and started building for all kinds of people. And that would have probably scared me before the transition, but coming out of it, I was like, okay, well, God, if you told me you're my provider, you've driven that into my heart, which we can talk about some more if you want. Let's do it. And 5 years later, there's no looking back. It's been a blast. And so I think that analysis is important, but I'll tell you, for me, the analysis of what I was going to do was not nearly as important as aligning the priorities appropriately. It just seemed it was such a great opportunity because I didn't have to decide I needed a paycheck this month or next, or really several, because we could live below our means. I just said, all right, Lord, what is important? And it's very fun when you lay that out, maybe for the first time in your life. And I'm surprised how often I talk to 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old men who have never just written on a piece of paper their priorities. They might say it's God and family and fun, but they've never really written down, okay, if I spend 8 hours watching football every Saturday, that seems to be a higher priority than whatever I'm not doing 8 hours of, you know, and you start laying that out, and it became very easy. Difficult to do, but easy to understand what I needed to look at. And I made some non-negotiables. I work out of my house now, have for years. I think Tom and I talked about this, I became a primary parent. There was a period of time where my wife's a pretty successful lady too, and she was home for 12 years and she wanted to get back out in the world. And so she started doing some work. And I was basically super dad for about a year. I worked out of my house. I did tons of work. It ended up being very fruitful financially, but there was no guarantees. Mm-hmm. And I got to be dad. I was there for every drop off in the morning and pick up every afternoon. And I got to go to every game. At the church, I was able to serve as the chairman of a board for a period of time, which I never would have had time for before. But mm-hmm. when your priorities are aligned, it makes it a lot easier to say yes and no. So that was my strategy, was what was important to me. Because I'd really spent 12 years doing what was important to a different person. And that person ran a company. And it became very obvious to me that was no way to live. So.
Wow. That's excellent. So a MAP stands for Master Action Plan. Right? Somebody's asking about that. Yeah. So it's a Master Action Plan. It's kind of developing a path that you can move forward. I want to get at something that looks like it might be a little bit of a problem in the pursuit of the next step career-wise. And I'm going to jump on something you, Mark, and Mike have both said. Mike, you said you wish you could take a time out, a little sabbatical, maybe to keep you from moving too quickly into something. And Mark, you've seen some of the danger of guys who take a pause because they lose an edge or some confidence, and then they end up being hurried. It seems like that maybe the common thread between what sounds like kind of different philosophies, take a sabbatical or don't sabbatical, the common thread between those two is trying to avoid a place of panic, you know, or impulsive action rather than thoughtful, prayerful action where you're getting some counsel from others. Am I touching on it right in that, from y'all's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, I think there's, you can take, there's a difference between taking a sabbatical and still, being prayerful and and making your roadmap and engaging your network. I mean, you can still do those things. That's where, I mean, where I've seen where it's not worked well for some of my friends is where it was like they treated it like they were on vacation for 6 months. And then to re-engage, like from that kind of a point, to then re-engage your network and think about what you want to do at that point, that was what was tough.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. That's super helpful. I think that's good coaching. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about calling a timeout, I mean, many of you guys may have read Bob Buford's book, Time Out. And I was 1 month away from my 50th birthday. Matter of fact, we had a huge birthday party planned out in Napa Valley. And the first question was, man, do I need to change that so I could refocus my plans? And we still went through with that, and it was great. It was a great time. It was refreshing to go do that. But I came back, and man, I went into major do mode. And not that I would take a 6 month or a 4 month vacation and go play golf every day, like I do here in Saudi Arabia. Not really, but I definitely, I just had the pace wrong. So as I spent more time at home, more time working on the deals, believe it or not, my quiet time went from the 10 to 20 minutes in the morning to like 60 to 90 minutes. My journaling went from a couple of, sentences to a couple of pages while I was filling up the book of Mike that I'll pass on to my kids someday. And so everything started to just change. And I started having deeper conversations with my circle of trust friends, started praying more. As I felt like God was pulling me to a totally different direction. Would that have happened if I had not gone through that? I don't know. Yeah. I don't know, but well, I'll tell you this crash that we went through, and now another oil crash, if those that are, from Houston, I probably would have lost everything. So if we had done a deal back in 2016, who knows? I mean, it probably would have been turned upside down, bankrupt. Many bankruptcies are going on now in the upstream space, exactly what I was pursuing. So like I said, God had his own, he is sovereign. He had a whole nother plan. And I think I just fought against it initially, now looking back, and I'm not sure, maybe just pausing it a little bit and just, the analogy that I like to use when I mentor other guys is when you're skiing, I was way out over my tips on this Guidestone energy. And so when that happens, you're skiing very dangerously. And so I just should have been more balanced. I should have been more patient with it. I should have done more due diligence on it. I I still would have pursued it, but I probably would have done some things differently with that.
Yeah. Now, Mark, you said something really interesting to me. You said, this is kind of rear view mirror perspective, but you said virtually every opportunity that never materialized for you, eventually you were thankful you didn't get it.
That is true. Yeah. It's the Garth Brooks song, Thank God for Unanswered Prayers. And I think, again, that goes back to, I think what Mike said, being balanced, taking time to know the path that God is gonna lead you to. And I just finished a book for people with called From Crackhead to CEO. And if any of y'all have seen the commercials, Mike Lindell, My Pillow, and if you read that book, you can't come away with not truly understanding and believing that God has a path for all of us. And he puts front and center on the front cover and the back cover, Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. And that, to me, is, I mean, you read that book, it gives you a real sense that God he's in charge, not us. As much as we would like to control things, we're not the ultimate decider.
Yeah. Awesome. So we're just about the place where we got to move towards bring in for landing. So I have two more things I'd love you guys to address. One is, and it's already been folded in many ways, but if you have something else, what have you discovered about God or your faith during your transition season? And then the other thing I'd love to have you touch on, if you got something that comes to mind, is what do you know now that you wish you had known when you started into transition that might be helpful to help somebody else? Anybody? Andy, you got anything there?
Sure. So I think I kind of hit it earlier. I do passionately believe that the Lord wants you to understand he's the one providing for you. I don't, we get it really confused when we think we're the substance behind the things that we eat, sleep in, and drive around in. And there's plenty of really talented, capable people that don't have those things. And there's plenty of really untalented, non-capable people that have them. And I don't know the answers to why, but it becomes very clear that he's in control of it. Both of these guys talked about opportunities. I was offered a job that the company got sued out of their mind like a year after I transitioned. And you're like, okay, good. Glad I wasn't there for that. Glad I wasn't part of that process. That would have been more anxiety. And so you're thankful for those. And so I think that's the biggest one. The Lord's not joking around when he says, I take care of the birds of the air and I take care of the flowers of the field. I'm going to take care of you. Mm-hmm. He's not saying that to make you feel better. He's saying it because it's his responsibility to do it. We may not like how he does it, but he's going to do it. And that's probably the biggest thing I've taken from it. And from a faith-based perspective, it gives me way more peace. I mean, just recently, Mike mentioned this, real estate world, you can imagine I'm on the tip of the spear for all retail development. So you can imagine when retail sales drop by 80%, nobody says, let's open the next location. And that's what I do. And so I think we lost in our company, and it's all relative, but I think our revenue for my group that I work with dropped by 90% and our projects all died. And I'll tell you, 10 years ago, I would have panicked. And it's really funny. The Lord was just like, take a break, take a deep breath, make sure everyone that you work with is taken care of. And that's been what I've been doing for the last 3 months. And out of that, 4 or 5 things have happened to provide for us. And it's been wonderful. And I don't equate God with the cash machine, because he's not, but he's very faithful to show up when you're relying on him. And so I think that's that. And then I think your other question was, what do I wish I'd known?
Yeah.
Or what do I wish I knew then, what I know now?
Yeah.
And this is just good heart for all men to hear, is that if you're really willing to work hard and you'll apply yourself, there's always something else to do. It may not be at the same level that you were at before. It may not be the same prestige in your mind. It may not be what your peer group expects of you. But I've rarely run across somebody who's not eminently employable. We haven't talked about this at all, but my wife and I also want a franchise. So we actually run a preschool. So we hire and fire on a regular basis to take care of kids. As you can imagine, that's been fun during the COVID era. And we take care of a lot of people. And I'll tell you, when I meet people with great attitudes who want to do things, I've hired people to be development managers for me who had no real estate experience if they had the right attitudes. And so what I tell people all the time is the fear of there's not another thing is in our current climate is an inappropriate fear. There'll be something else. And that's kind of what I wish I knew. I thought the work ended when I was basically fired. And it turned out that's when it was starting. Oh, and so I don't know if that's helpful.
Mike, you got anything for us?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, landing here in Saudi, it was such a huge change. I mean, everything changed, Obviously different language, different work schedule is different. I mean, everything about my life is different. And I, the first weekend, I bawled like a baby. And I was like, man, second guessing myself. Did I make the right call? And I met the Filipino taxi cab driver. I went to the church and I started thinking, God placed in my heart, it's not about why I'm here, but what am I going to do while I'm here? How am I going to serve him? How am I going to give him the glory while I'm here? And I totally changed my whole perspective by focusing on what I'm going to do for God, not what am I going to do for Mike Gustafson. What am I going to do for him? How am I going to exalt him and be a salt and a light in this, in this Muslim country? And then, gosh, what have I learned, or what I've done differently? It's not as scary. The unknown is not as scary as I thought it was going to be.
That's a golden nugget, brother.
This has been a. I know it's hard for other folks, but this has been a wild, crazy ride. It's not about me. It's about God's plan. And right now we're, laying off people here in Saudi Arabia is kind of like foreign. I mean, totally foreign. They don't lay off. They believe in full employment, not full profits. So the whole concept is different. I tell people, because in the petrochemical space, refinery space, I'd be letting go of people left and right in this environment that we're in. And we're having to let go of 5% of the workforce. And they're like in shock and awe over that. And so God has used this, my transition has been able to share with some of these guys, those guys I've had to have those conversations with. I've had so much more empathy with them to be able to help them out through these kind of painful discussions that I could never really have experienced before.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you, Mike. Mark, you got any last words for us?
Well, I think for me personally, it's got me, through the transition and things I've learned, it's made me closer to God, and it's made me closer to my family, especially, my wife and kids, but also developing a real network of men. I go to Bible Study Fellowship, my BSF, prayer friends. I mean, don't be afraid to lean on that network.
Mm-hmm.
Lean on God, but lean on your network. And prayer does do magical things. Mm-hmm. That's my message.
All right on. Yeah. Well, I love that. I thank you guys so much for being here and sharing your heart. And there's comments that are coming in that are saying the same thing, just so you know. They very much appreciate y'all's contribution to this conversation today. Once again, guys, great to be with you. We'll look forward to being with you next time out. If I can do anything for you in the meantime, let me know. God bless.